Hey everyone, this is DREF, and I realize that you guys may have trouble spelling the Dutch and French names in this documentary, so I have included all the names in the description below. Thanks. The story of Jesus' death and resurrection reveals to us a God who is waiting. My name is Henri Nouwen. I was born on January 24th, 1932 in Nijkerk, Netherlands. My family was Catholic. My mother's name was Marie Rameslaar. She was emotional, nurturing, loving, creative, expressive, and deeply religious. My father's name was Laurent Sr. He was distant and critical towards me. He worked as a tax lawyer. I had two brothers named Paul and Laurent, and a sister named Laurien. During German occupation, my family moved to The Hague. I didn't think much about the war. When I had to help my father hide from German soldiers or scavenge for food, I found those moments full of adventure and excitement. World War II didn't affect my mentality. As a child, I would often ask my parents if they loved me. My childhood dream was to enter the priesthood. As a young adult, I entered the seminary in Rijsenburg. I was ordained a priest on July 21st, 1957. After my ordination, I went on to study psychology at the University of Nijmegen. I became interested in the work of Anton Boysen, clinical pastoral educator and a Presbyterian minister. Reading about him wasn't enough. I wanted to see his work in action. Unfortunately, he died before I arrived in America in 1964. In America, I studied psychology and theology at the Menninger Foundation program. I soon became interested in American politics, such as the reports of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. After finishing my studies, I began to teach at the University of Notre Dame. This is where I published my first two books, Intimacy and Creative Ministry. After 2 years, I returned to the Netherlands. Back at home, I began to teach pastoral psychology and theology. It was here that I realized my passion for teaching pastoral ministry. The Dutch public did not receive me well. They were used to having priests that were socially involved and put prayer second. I wasn't that kind of priest. I always put prayer at the top of my list. I eventually returned to America. Upon arriving in America, I received an invitation to teach at Yale. I would often bring up Rembrandt's artwork in my lectures because I was especially fond of this artist. Despite being popular at Yale, I found myself unable to share my personal experiences. So I took a 7th-month break and stayed at the Abbey of the Genesee in New York. It was here that I wrote Reaching Out, the 3 movements of the spiritual life, as well as realizing that I wasn't called to the monastic life. Reaching Out is a guide meant to answer the question, what does it mean to live a life in the Spirit of Jesus Christ? The first movement I wrote about is moving from loneliness to solitude. This movement deals with our relationship with ourselves. I feel that our society uses distractions to avoid being alone. Yes, being alone is not fun and sometimes painful, but I think that reflecting on ourselves can help us be at peace and be patient. The second movement is to move from hostility to hospitality. This movement is about our relationship with others. I believe that when our space has been invaded, we're inclined to see strangers as the enemy, and therefore will become aggressive. In order to fix that, I suggest a shift in our attitude to a Christian manner. The third movement is about moving from illusion to prayer. In the past, I have wanted my plans to go my way. I wanted to decide my own fate, but this is not the reality. This illusion makes us forget that God is out there, and I believe that it is with prayer that strengthens our relationship with God. 3 years passed after writing Reaching Out. My parents came to visit me in the States. During their visit, I realized that my mother was looking unwell. After they returned to the Netherlands, my mother was identified to have cancer. I immediately left the States and got to the hospital just in time. My mother died on October 9th, 1978. This death, although it was devastating, brought my father closer to me. Although he never reached the intimate relationship that I had with my mother, my father became less distant. He acted like my life advisor. I eventually returned to America, but I did not return to Yale, but to the Abbey. I left Yale because I was preparing for a vocation in Latin America. I had joined a missionary group called the Maryknoll Fathers and Brothers. I received language training in Bolivia. During that time, I saw that Bolivia had an unstable military government. There were coups and there were counter coups. So then I moved to Peru and then to Guatemala. Although my journey was short, I wrote a journal called Gracias about the culture there. After my return to America, I was invited to teach at Harvard. I was popular there, but I was very unhappy. I felt that my spirituality was burnt out, and that feeling led me into a spiraling depression. I hated my time at Harvard due to the competitive nature of the students there. I preferred to minister a community. So I took a break from Harvard and went back to Guatemala. While I was in Guatemala, I was horrified by the civil war that had broken out. So I left Guatemala to meet a colleague named Jean Vanier. Jean Vanier was the founder of L'Arche, an international movement of communities that welcome people with disabilities, both physically and mentally. After hearing about it, I was hooked. I decided to go to its main campus in Trosly, France. When I got there, I immediately fell in love with the community. I knew this was where I belonged. So in 1986, I was invited to be a pastor in the L'Arche community of Daybreak in Ontario, Canada, a branch of the one in France. This is where I spent most of my literary career by writing books such as In the Name of Jesus, Reflections on Christian Leadership, The Return of the Prodigal Son, Story of Homecoming, and Finding My Way Home, Pathways to Life and Spirit. I wrote In the Name of Jesus in 1989 in order that I could share my struggles as a Christian leader during my first years at L'Arche. The first temptation I had was the temptation to be relevant. During the first years, I struggled to fit in. Most of my scholarly past experiences when teaching at Yale or Harvard didn't help me since most of the handicapped people weren't educated enough. I was open to affirmations and rejections. My reputation depended on how I was perceived at the moment. I felt that I wasn't making an impact on the L'Arche community. After many contemplative prayers, I realized that it wasn't about how much I had or can accomplish, but it's about how much I love Jesus. My second temptation was popularity. Back when I was a teacher, I didn't have to tell my students when or where I was at all times. I was free to do what I wanted to do outside of class without anyone questioning. At L'Arche, this individualism did not exist. I couldn't live my private life privately. I once left L'Arche on a trip. One of my patients named Trevor didn't know that I had left. When I arrived at my destination, he asked me why I had left him. It was then that I realized that a true ministry must be mutual. I must be willing to give up a part of my individualism for others in a ministry. My third temptation was being powerful. During one of my homilies, one of my patients named Bill disagreed with my sermon, but he didn't wait to tell me that he disagreed after the sermon. He interrupted my sermon. I was angry about this. I had let my desire to lead be fueled by my desire to control the situation. I continuously had to remind myself not to lead out of powerfulness, but to lead out of humility. Several years later, after writing In the Name of Jesus, I was hit by a car. The accident was not severe, as I did not have any external injuries, but I did suffer from internal bleeding. It was at this moment that I thought about the meaning of death. What does life mean? I would later share this story and my thoughts about death at the conference in Chicago. Soon after, I wrote my best-selling book, The Return of the Prodigal Son, Story of Homecoming, which was published in 1992. The first encounter I had with this painting by Rembrandt was back in 1983. At some point in my years at Harvard, I had the opportunity to go to St. Petersburg in Russia. The painting by Rembrandt captivated me. I reflected on this particular painting for over 2 hours. A few days later, I went back and stared at the painting. Because of the time of day, the glare of the sun made the painting hard to see. So I grabbed a chair from another room so that I could look at it from a different angle. The museum curator was not pleased and argued with me in Russian. I, however, could not speak Russian, so I had to keep making hand gestures. Several minutes later, one of my Russian friends showed up. The guard explained to my friend what happened. After a couple of minutes, my friend and the guard brought me a nice chair to sit on. I now had my own personal chair. I could finally admire this painting in peace. So I stared at this painting for more than 4 hours that day. I love Rembrandt's artwork, especially The Return of the Prodigal Son, because I can really identify with the younger son. The younger son is dressed in shabby clothes. He was lost and comes to his father asking for forgiveness. The young son has truly come from nothing. In this painting, I see both myself and Rembrandt as the younger son. Rembrandt had painted this artwork shortly before his death. He used to be a famous and arrogant young artist. Towards the end of his life, he had experienced the tragedy and sorrow. He lost his wife and 2 of his children in the span of 5 years. His artwork did not continue to be famous either. At one point, he had to sell his house in order to avoid bankruptcy. I think that Rembrandt painted the younger son that way because he wanted to show that the younger son had once been filled with riches, but has now come to his father empty-handed. This painting helped me get out of my depression when I was at Harvard. During that time, I didn't know where I was going. I felt that I didn't belong at Harvard. My love for Jesus had gone away, and I felt nothing. When I saw this picture, I could see myself in the younger son. I was lost and scared, and I didn't know who to turn to. I saw that the younger son had turned to his father. And then I realized that Rembrandt had portrayed his version of God in the painting through the father. The father is caring, compassionate, loving, merciful, and full of forgiveness, some of the characteristics of God. The way the light shines on these 2 figures shows a scene of mercy and forgiveness. From that moment, I knew that God always loved me and be at my side. It prompted me to actively find my calling at large. About 3 years later, I wrote another book called The Path series. It was published in 1995 and included 3 essays that I had written. After my death, this book was renamed to Finding My Way Home, Pathways to Life and Spirit, and republished in 2001. It also added a 4th section about a lecture that I had given at the National Catholic HIV/AIDS Conference in Chicago. The lecture was then put into writing by my editor. I would say that this is the easiest book to comprehend out of my literary works. My first essay is The Path of Power. I wanted to share about how men misuse power and how God uses his power. God would be distraught over the wars that have taken place, families that have been torn apart, prisoners that have been locked behind bars, and many others that are starving and neglected. Then we see God who is all-powerful, but chose to be powerless by coming down and becoming flesh. And that it is through God's power of love that brings us creativity and leadership in His temporary kingdom. My second essay is The Path of Peace. This essay connects closely to the Beatitudes. I wanted to share my lessons of peace that I learned from my friend Adam at L'Arche. I was amazed at Adam's source of peace, and I had to find that out. Eventually, I learned that this peace from Adam comes from being present to each other, loving God, and working together in harmony. The third essay is The Path of Waiting. I wanted to expose our culture's fears of the unknown and the need to control it as much as possible. Sometimes we want to have everything our way, and when God tells us otherwise, we'll refuse His plans for us. I contrast our culture to that of Zechariah and Elizabeth, who waited patiently for the birth of their son despite being old. Waiting should be a chance to be alive and not to live in a painful experience. Final path is the path of living and dying. This is where I shared my thoughts on death when I had gotten into that car accident. I learned that I wasn't scared of death. I was calm. I felt that God would keep me safe or bring me back home. I knew that I would be with God no matter the result. Throughout my life, I had already been answering the question of how can I live so that my death will be fruitful for others. I finally had no doubts that I was close to God and that my relationship with Him was strong. I knew that God was and will always be with me. My best-selling book, The Return of the Prodigal Son, led to several interviews. One interview was to take place in Russia, so I packed my bags and left L'Arche for Russia in September 1996. I took a detour and stopped by the Netherlands to visit my family. While at the hotel, I suffered a heart attack and everything went dark. Hi, I'm Henri Nouwen's editor, and I'll be continuing the rest of his life story. Nouwen was then immediately rushed to the hospital. Everyone thought that Nouwen was fine, but then because the first attack had weakened him greatly, Nouwen did not survive the second attack. Henri Joseph Machiel Nouwen died on September 21st, 1996. He had two funerals, one in the cathedral in the Netherlands and one at the L'Arche community of Daybreak in Canada. To summarize, Nouwen believed in God, as he was Catholic. He definitely believed that the world was chaotic, but that there was still hope. Yes, human nature is inclined to evil, but it can be avoided by living a life in the spirit of Jesus Christ. I think this was Nouwen's main point. If I were to compare him to other authors such as Jack London, I would say that Nouwen definitely stands out. He isn't a naturalist like London, but also doesn't fit in with other authors such as Steinbeck or Porter. He stands out because he shares his personal experiences as if we were with him during those struggles. He not only shares these experiences, but he also incorporated how focused he was with following the path of Jesus Christ as best as he could. I believe that this is why Nouwen stands out.